You can take the guest room, Diane. It's yours now, my son said, without even looking at me. I remember the exact way the words settled over the table, light and casual, as if he were offering her a cup of coffee instead of handing over part of my home. The dining room looked exactly as it always had, mahogany table polished to a soft shine, the same cream-colored plates I'd used for every family gathering over the past 20 years, the faint scent of rosemary from the roast I had spent all afternoon preparing, but something had shifted, something quiet and irreversible. I sat at the head of the table, the seat I had always taken, the one that used to mean something, and for the first time, it felt like I was sitting in the wrong place. Diane smiled, slow and satisfied, as she reached for her wine glass. I'll start moving my things in next weekend, she said, as if this had already been decided, as if the conversation had happened somewhere without me. No one objected.
Not Ethan.
Not Rachel. Not even a polite hesitation, not a glance in my direction. Just silence. The kind of silence that tells you everyone else already knows the script. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, the way I always did when I didn't trust myself to speak. That's quite a plan, I said, keeping my voice even, almost pleasant. Rachel let out a soft laugh, the kind that barely makes a sound but still manages to fill the room. It just makes sense, she said, cutting into her food. This house has more than enough space. This house. I noticed the way she said it, not your house, not Mom's house, just this house, like it belonged to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone but me. I glanced down at my plate, though I hadn't taken a single bite. The silverware felt heavier than usual in my hands. For a moment, I wondered if I had missed something, some conversation, some agreement made behind closed doors. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized this wasn't sudden for them. Only for me. Diane leaned back in her chair, completely at ease. It'll be nice, she added. Families should stick together.
I almost smiled at that.
Almost. Because if there was one thing I had learned over the past few years, it was that people like to use words like family when they wanted something. I looked around the table again, really looked this time. Ethan avoided my eyes, focusing intently on his plate, as if the pattern in the china had suddenly become fascinating. Rachel reached for the salt, her movements calm, practiced. Comfortable. Too comfortable. And that's when it hit me. Not all at once, but slowly, like a door creaking open in a quiet house. I wasn't being included in a decision. I was being informed of one. And somehow, without anyone saying it out loud, I understood something else, something colder, something that settled deep in my chest and refused to move. This dinner wasn't about Diane moving in. It was about me no longer belonging. I cleared the plates slowly that night, one at a time, as if the weight of each dish meant something more than it should. The kitchen felt different, quieter than usual, even though I could still hear Diane's voice drifting in from the dining room, light and confident, already discussing where she might put her furniture. I stood at the sink with the water running longer than necessary, my hands resting on the edge of the counter as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. No one had asked me a single question. Not once. Not even out of courtesy. When I finally turned off the faucet, the silence that followed felt heavier than any words spoken that evening. I dried my hands carefully and walked back toward the hallway, pausing just before I stepped into the living room. We can move Mom's things upstairs, Rachel was saying, her tone practical, almost efficient. There is more space up there anyway. I did not move. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. Mom's things. Not my room. Not my space. Just things. Ethan responded quietly, but I caught enough. Yeah, that makes sense. It will be easier for Diane. Easier for Diane. I leaned against the wall, steadying myself, though I was not sure why I needed to. It was not shock anymore. It was something else. Something colder. Something clearer. I stepped into the room then, my footsteps soft against the hardwood floor. The conversation stopped immediately, as if someone had pressed a switch. Rachel gave me a quick smile. Too quick, and Diane adjusted her posture, sitting up straighter, though her expression did not change. Only Ethan looked briefly uncomfortable, but even that passed in seconds. Everything okay, Mom? He asked, as if nothing had been said. I nodded once. Of course, I replied, my voice steady. Just cleaning up. No one mentioned what I had overheard. No one needed to. The truth was already there, hanging quietly between us. I moved past them and into the living room, my eyes scanning the space I had arranged piece by piece over the years. The framed photos on the shelf. The chair by the window where I used to sit every morning with my coffee. The small details that once felt permanent now looked temporary, as if they had already started to fade. I noticed something else then, something I had not paid attention to before. A folder on the coffee table.
Thick.
Official looking. The kind of folder that did not belong in casual conversation. Rachel reached for it a little too quickly when she saw me looking. Just some paperwork, she said lightly. I did not ask what kind. I did not need to. Because in that moment, standing in the middle of the room that no longer felt like mine, I understood something I should have realized sooner. This was not a sudden decision. It was a completed one. And whatever had been decided, it had already been signed. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, long before the house had a chance to fill with voices that no longer felt familiar. The air was still, the kind of quiet that used to comfort me, but now it only made everything sharper. I moved through the kitchen slowly, out of habit more than intention, filling the kettle, setting out a single cup, the same routine I had followed for years. But something about it felt misplaced, as if I were borrowing someone else's morning instead of living my own. When the coffee finished brewing, I carried it to the dining table and sat in the same chair as the night before. The seat still felt right beneath me, but the meaning behind it had shifted. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth settle into my fingers, and stared at the surface of the table where everything had changed with a few quiet sentences. It was not just what they had said. It was what they had not said.
No explanation.
No discussion. No acknowledgement that I should have been part of it. I replayed Rachel's words in my mind, the calm certainty in her voice, the way she spoke about my belongings as if they were already packed away. I thought about Ethan, about the boy who used to ask me before making even the smallest decision, who would stand in this very kitchen and wait for my approval. Somewhere along the way, that version of him had disappeared, replaced by someone who could sit across from me and agree to move me without ever looking me in the eye. I took a slow sip of coffee, though I could barely taste it, and let my gaze drift toward the hallway. The door to the study was slightly open, just enough to reveal the edge of the desk where my husband used to keep his documents. He had always been careful with paperwork, meticulous in a way that made me feel safe, like everything was accounted for, protected. For a moment, I considered getting up, walking in, opening the drawers, searching for something that would explain all of this. But I did not move. Not yet. Because another thought had already begun to take shape. Quieter, but far more unsettling. What if the explanation was not hidden at all? What if it had been happening in plain sight, piece by piece, while I trusted the wrong people to handle the details? I set the cup down carefully and listened as faint footsteps sounded from upstairs, followed by the soft murmur of voices. They were awake now, moving through the house, as if it belonged to them, as if it always had. I remained where I was, still and silent, letting the realization settle fully into place. This was not about Diane needing a place to stay. This was not about space or convenience or family. This was about control. And somehow, without raising their voices, without making a scene, they had already taken it. By mid-morning, the house no longer sounded like mine. Cabinets opened and closed with a rhythm I did not recognize. Footsteps moved with a confidence that did not ask permission, and voices carried easily from room to room as if they had always belonged there. I remained at the table longer than usual, my hands resting flat against the wood, feeling the faint grooves and imperfections I knew by heart. Every inch of this place had once told a story I could trace back to a moment, a decision, a sacrifice. Now it felt like those stories had been rewritten without me. I finally stood and walked toward the study, the same room I had hesitated to enter earlier. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, a familiar sound that used to bring comfort. The desk was exactly as it had always been, papers neatly stacked, drawers aligned, everything in its place. My husband had believed in order, in clarity, in making sure nothing important was left uncertain. I reached for the top drawer and pulled it open slowly, my fingers brushing against folders I had seen countless times but rarely touched. Insurance documents, old receipts, tax records from years ago. Nothing unusual at first glance. But as I moved things aside, I noticed something missing. A folder that used to sit in the back corner, thicker than the others, marked clearly in his handwriting. I paused, my hand still inside the drawer, and tried to recall when I had last seen it. It had always been there. Always. I closed the drawer carefully and stepped back, my eyes scanning the room again, this time with a different kind of attention. Not looking for comfort, but for absence. That was when I heard Rachel's voice behind me, light but edged with something sharper. "Looking for something?" she asked. I turned slowly, keeping my expression neutral. "Just organizing a few things," I replied. She stepped a little closer, her smile polite but firm, the kind that did not invite questions. "We have already gone through most of the paperwork," she said. "Just to make things easier moving forward." Easier for whom? I wondered, though I did not say it out loud. Instead, I nodded once, as if that explanation was enough. She lingered for a second longer, watching me, then turned and walked away, her footsteps fading down the hall. I remained where I was, the silence settling back into the room like it had been waiting for her to leave. Gone through the paperwork. The words echoed quietly, fitting too neatly with everything else that had begun to surface. The folder was not misplaced. It had been removed.
Just like my
role in the decisions being made. I walked over to the desk again and rested my hand against its surface, steady and cool beneath my palm. For years, I had trusted that everything important in this house had been protected, documented, respected. But trust, I was beginning to understand, could be moved just as easily as furniture. And sometimes, you did not notice it was gone until someone else started arranging your life without asking where you wanted things to be. I did not ask any more questions that morning. Not because I did not have them, but because I already knew the answers would not come from them. Instead, I moved through the house the way I always had, slow and deliberate, but this time I was paying attention to things I had ignored for too long. The small changes, the quiet shifts, the details that only become obvious when you stop assuming everything is the same. In the kitchen, I opened the drawer where I kept the spare keys. It was something I had done out of habit for years, checking that everything was where it belonged. But now, as I lifted the tray and looked underneath, I noticed the empty space immediately. One of the house keys was gone. Not misplaced. Not forgotten.
taken.
I closed the drawer without making a sound and rested my hand on the counter, letting that realization settle in beside everything else. This had not started last night. It had been happening gradually, carefully, piece by piece. I walked into the living room again, my eyes drawn to the shelves where I kept the family photo albums. I reached for one and opened it, flipping through pages filled with birthdays, holidays, quiet moments that once felt solid and real. There was Ethan as a boy, smiling up at me with complete trust. There was Diane younger, standing beside me at a time when she needed help and I had given it without hesitation. I remember the day she called me, her voice shaking, telling me she had nowhere to go. I had told her to come here, that this house was always open to family. I had meant it. I always meant it. That was the problem. I closed the album gently and placed it back on the shelf, my fingers lingering for a moment before I let go. Trust had never felt like a risk to me. It had felt like the right thing to do. But now, standing in a house that no longer responded to me the way it once had, I began to see it differently. I heard footsteps behind me again, lighter this time, followed by Diane's voice. "I was thinking we could repaint the upstairs," she said casually, as if discussing the weather. "Something brighter. It feels a little outdated." I turned to look at her, really look at her, and noticed something I had missed before. Not just confidence. Ownership. The kind that does not come from asking, but from already believing something belongs to you. "You have plans already," I said, my tone calm, almost curious. She smiled, not denying it. "We all agreed it was time for a change," she replied. "We all." The words settled quietly, but they carried weight. Because, once again, I was not included in that number. I nodded once, as if I understood, though what I understood was not what she intended. This was no longer about hints or suspicions or small inconsistencies. The decisions had been made. The changes had already begun. And whatever they had done, however they had done it, they believed there was nothing I could do to stop them. I looked around the room one more time, taking in every detail, every object, every space that had once felt permanent. Then I turned away, not in defeat, but in something far more precise. Because if there was one thing I still had, it was clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to realize, could be far more powerful than trust ever was. That afternoon, I left the house without telling anyone where I was going, which in itself was something I had not done in years. I picked up my purse, the same one I had carried to grocery stores and church meetings and quiet lunches with old friends, and walked out the front door as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. No one stopped me. No one asked. The air outside felt different, sharper, almost unfamiliar, and for a moment I stood on the front steps looking back at the house, noticing how still it appeared from the outside. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Solid.
Permanent.
Untouched. But I knew better now. I got into my car and sat there for a few seconds before starting the engine, letting my hands rest on the steering wheel as I thought through what I needed to do next. Not what I wanted. What I needed. There was a difference now. I drove across town to a place I had not visited in over a year, a small office building with a brick exterior and a sign that had not changed in decades. Howard and Associates. The name alone brought back a sense of order, of structure, of things being handled the right way. I parked in the same spot I used to when my husband was still alive, and we would come here together, reviewing documents, asking questions, making sure everything was clear. He had trusted Mr. Howard. And more importantly, Mr. Howard had always insisted that I understand everything as well. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of paper and polished wood grounding me in a way I had not felt all day. The receptionist looked up and smiled politely, though there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Mrs. Collins," she said. "It has been a while." I returned the smile, small but genuine. "Yes, it has," I replied. "Is Mr. Howard available?" She hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Let me check for you." I took a seat in the waiting area, folding my hands in my lap, the same way I had done the night before, but this time it felt different. This was not restraint. This was focus. A few minutes later, the door to the inner office opened and Mr. Howard himself stepped out, older than I remembered, but still carrying the same steady presence. "Margaret," he said, his voice warm but curious. "I was not expecting to see you today." I stood and met his gaze directly. "Neither was I," I answered. There was no need to explain everything in the hallway. He gestured for me to come in, closing the door behind us once we were inside. The room looked unchanged, files neatly organized, everything in its place, just like it had always been. I took a seat across from his desk and for a moment, I simply looked at him, choosing my words carefully. "I need you to tell me something," I said finally. "Has anything about my house changed?" The question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but heavy with everything behind it. Mr. Howard did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a folder on his desk, one that he had not needed to search for. That alone told me enough. He opened it slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something more serious. "Margaret," he said, his voice measured now. "There was a transfer filed several months ago." The words landed quietly, but they did not surprise me. Not anymore. I did not interrupt him. I did not react. I simply listened, because this, I realized, was where the truth had been kept all along. Not hidden, just kept somewhere I had not thought to look. Mr. Howard turned the document toward me, sliding it across the desk with a careful, deliberate motion, as if he understood that once I saw it, there would be no going back to not knowing. I looked down at the page, my eyes scanning the lines slowly, taking in the formal language, the dates, the signatures. My name was there, written clearly, unmistakably. But something about it felt wrong the moment I saw it. Not unfamiliar, but not right. "This transfer," he continued, his tone steady, was processed and recorded. Ownership of the property was reassigned. I did not look up. Not yet. I let my gaze rest on the signature again, studying the curve of each letter, the way it attempted to replicate something personal, something that had always belonged only to me. I did not sign this, I said quietly. The words came without hesitation, without doubt, because I knew, not from memory, not from confusion, but from certainty. Mr. Howard leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression tightening in a way that confirmed he believed me. That is what I was afraid of, he replied. I lifted my eyes then, meeting his gaze directly. Who filed it? I asked. He hesitated for a brief moment, just enough to acknowledge the weight of the answer. The paperwork was submitted through a third party, but the authorization listed your son as the acting contact. Ethan. The name settled into place, without needing to be spoken. I felt it more than I reacted to it. A quiet shift inside me. Something final. Something that closed the door on any lingering uncertainty. And the beneficiary? I asked, my voice still even. Mr. Howard glanced back at the document. Joint. Ownership was transferred to your son and his spouse. Rachel. Of course. I nodded once, slowly, as the full picture came into focus. Not sudden. Not careless. Planned. Structured. Executed. Every step taken with the confidence that I would not notice until it was too late. I placed my hand flat against the paper, not to hold it, but to study the moment itself. How long ago? I asked. 6 months, he replied. 6 months. I thought back over that time, the small changes, the subtle shifts, the quiet decisions that had begun to make sense only now. The missing folder. The new tone in Rachel's voice. Ethan's distance. Diane's sudden certainty. It had all been in motion long before that dinner. I let out a slow breath, not out of shock, but out of clarity. What can be done? I asked. This time, Mr. Howard did not hesitate. He leaned forward slightly, his voice firm, grounded in something I had not felt in that house for a long time. If the signature is not valid, then the transfer is not valid, he said. But we will need to prove it. I nodded again, absorbing the words, not as a question, but as a direction. Proof. Evidence. Steps. This was no longer about feelings or assumptions. This was about facts. I looked back down at the document one last time, my expression unchanged, my mind already moving ahead. They believed it was finished, that everything had been decided, that I had already lost. I stood up slowly, smoothing my hand over the edge of the desk before stepping back. Then we will prove it, I said, my voice calm, steady, and certain. Because for the first time since that dinner, I was not reacting anymore. I was preparing. When I stepped back into the house that evening, nothing had changed on the surface, and that was what made it so clear. Diane's voice echoed faintly from upstairs, light and casual, as if she had already settled into a rhythm that did not include me. Rachel was in the kitchen, rearranging cabinets with quiet efficiency, moving dishes I had placed years ago into new positions without hesitation. Ethan sat in the living room, scrolling through his phone, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested everything was exactly as it should be. No one looked surprised to see me. No one asked where I had been. I set my purse down on the entry table and walked in as if I belonged there, because for now I still did. We were just talking about the upstairs, Rachel said, glancing over her shoulder with a polite smile that did not reach her eyes. Trying to make space. I nodded slightly, taking in the scene without reacting. That sounds productive, I replied, my voice even measured. I moved past her and into the living room, letting my gaze rest briefly on Ethan. He looked up for a moment, just long enough to acknowledge me, then returned to his screen. No questions. No concern. Just quiet acceptance. I sat down in the chair by the window, the one that had always been mine, and folded my hands in my lap. The house continued moving around me, voices and footsteps filling the space, but I remained still, observing, listening, learning, because now every detail mattered. Every word, every assumption they made about what I did not know. Diane came downstairs a few minutes later, her expression bright, energized. I was thinking we could bring in new furniture this weekend, she said, not to me but to the room. Start fresh. Start fresh.
I almost smiled at that.
Instead, I tilted my head slightly. That is quick, I said, my tone calm. She shrugged, completely at ease. No point in waiting. No point in waiting. Of course not. They believed there was nothing left to stop them. I let the conversation continue without interruption, their plans unfolding openly now, without caution, without restraint.
Dates.
Changes. Rearrangements. Each word adding another piece to a picture I could now see clearly. They were not hiding anything anymore.
They did not need to. That was their mistake.
I rose from the chair slowly and walked toward the hallway, my movements unhurried, deliberate. I may have a few things to take care of tomorrow, I said lightly, pausing just enough for them to hear. Rachel nodded without looking up. Of course, she replied. We will handle things here. I continued down the hall, my expression unchanged, my thoughts precise. They would handle things here.
For now.
I stepped into the study once more, closing the door softly behind me, and looked around the room with a different understanding than before. This was no longer a place of hesitation.
It was.
A place of preparation. I moved to the desk and opened a drawer, not searching this time, but selecting. Old documents, letters, anything that still carried weight, anything that still connected the past to the truth I now needed to prove. I gathered them carefully, stacking them with intention, my movements steady. Outside, I could still hear their voices, confident, certain, already living in a future they believed was secure. I did not interrupt them. I did not correct them, because the more certain they became, the less prepared they would be for what came next. And as I closed the drawer and held the documents in my hands, I understood something with complete clarity. They had already taken what they thought was mine. Now I was going to take back what was true. The next evening, I set the table again, just as I always had, placing each plate with quiet precision, aligning the silverware, smoothing the tablecloth until there were no creases left to distract from the moment. It felt almost identical to the night everything had changed, and that was exactly the point. Diane came down first, her steps light, her expression expectant. Rachel followed, already speaking about deliveries scheduled for the weekend, her voice steady, confident. Ethan arrived last, taking his seat without looking up, as if this were just another ordinary dinner. I took my place at the head of the table and folded my hands, waiting until everyone had settled before I spoke. Before we begin, I said calmly, my voice carrying just enough to quiet the room, there is something we need to go over. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me, not concerned, not cautious, just mildly curious. Diane leaned back slightly. What is it? She asked. I reached beside me and placed a folder on the table, the same kind of folder I had seen the day before, only this one was mine. I opened it slowly, not rushing, not hesitating, and turned it so they could see. This, I said, is the transfer document you have been relying on. Rachel's expression shifted first, just a flicker, but enough. Ethan sat up a little straighter. Diane's smile held, but it no longer reached her eyes. I continued, my tone unchanged. And this, I added, sliding a second set of papers beside it, is the verification from my attorney. No one spoke. The silence this time was different. It was not confident. It was waiting. The signature on that transfer, I said, looking at each of them in turn, is not mine. Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came out. Ethan looked between us, his expression tightening in a way I had not seen before. Diane's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. That document, I continued, has already been flagged, which means the transfer it represents does not hold. The words settled into the room slowly, but their meaning was immediate. Diane leaned forward now, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it. That cannot be right, she said. I met her gaze evenly. It is, I replied. I closed the folder gently, the sound soft but final. And until this is resolved properly, I added, nothing in this house changes. Rachel looked down at the papers again, her confidence gone, replaced by calculation. Ethan said nothing at all. For the first time since that first dinner, no one spoke over me. No one dismissed what I was saying. The balance had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I rose from my chair slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse as I stood. "Dinner is getting cold," I said, as if this were the only thing that mattered. Then I turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving them at the table with something they had not expected to face. Not anger, not confrontation, but certainty. And as I moved away, I did not need to look back to know that everything they thought was finished had just begun to fall apart.